Hello students, this is a quick review for Unit 7 Ecology. So if you are unable to go to the JAG review session, hopefully this video will help you review some information. Okay, so quickly, the definition of ecology: study of interactions among living things. So it's how organisms interact with each other and how they interact with their environment, so their surroundings. So ecology study environments at different levels. So this is where you have your levels of classification or levels of organization. So your smallest level is an individual organism, and then a bunch of those same organisms of one species make up a population. Then a bunch of populations with a bunch of different organisms or different species will make up a community. Then the community, a bunch of different communities will make up an ecosystem, and then several different ecosystems combine and make up a biosphere. Okay, so there's different research methods that we talked about in class. We talked about observations, which is carefully watching something over a period of time. Remember, there are direct and indirect surveys. So here's some different sampling techniques. These are what ecologists will use to help estimate the size of a population. So there's quadrats, indirect counting, and mark recapture. So your quadrats, that's using you count a number of species within a boundary. So essentially, they will set up a boundary, count a number of organisms within that area, and then from there, they can estimate the population size over a larger given area. And then indirect counting, so this is typically used for organisms that move around a lot and are difficult to see. The best thing to use this for is using organisms that create hives or burrows or nests and things like that. And then mark and recapture is counting species. So you capture them, you mark some of them, and then you release them back into the wild. So those organisms will then later on be recaptured, and then you can count those organisms, and from there do some calculations and create estimation of the population size. So here's some examples of some different marks and recaptures. You can see that this bird has a mark here, and then there's number marks, and this is marked as well. Okay, but some of these techniques are not the most accurate, so there are some limits to the accuracy. There's different sampling techniques and such that involve making some assumptions about what's being studied. So these are not 100% accurate. And then there's experimentation. So experimentation, these are ones that are performed in the lab, or actually in the field. So you can have lab experiments, so that allows researchers to control everything, or field experiments where you're able to get an actual picture. But there's so many variables that you're not able to control, so you can't actually determine cause and effect. And then there's modeling, which is using computer mathematical models to help demonstrate. So this could be predicting the growth of a population over an extended period of time, or something to that nature. All right, then you have biotic and abiotic factors. So biotic factors are the living things that are in an environment. So like your plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria. Abiotic factors are non-living things: moisture, temperature, wind, sunlight, soil. All right, so let's talk about biodiversity. Now, we will come back and reference this later on as well. But biodiversity is the assortment or variety of living things in an ecosystem. So it's the variety of living organisms in an ecosystem, okay? So the biosphere includes all ecosystems. So this is all portions of Earth that are inhabited by life. So the biotic and abiotic factors will interact in the biosphere. So you have a habitat versus a niche. So again, this is some vocab stuff. So habitat is all the aspects of an area in which an organism lives. So this is all the biotic, so the living factors, and abiotic, non-living factors in that environment, okay? But a niche is all the factors that a species needs to survive and stay healthy and reproduce. So this is food, this is your abiotic conditions, and the behaviors that they serve in that population. Resource availability. So when resources are available, there's different things or different competition that can occur. So that's when competition specifically is when two species are competing for the same resource, okay? And then there's the competitive exclusion principle, and it essentially keeps two species from occupying the same niche, okay? So competitive exclusion is when no two species can occupy the same niche. So, yes. So then there's things with competitive exclusion, there's different things that can happen. So one species will eventually can either be better suited for that niche, and the other one will essentially be pushed out of that niche or become extinct. One can be divided, or the niche could be divided, or the two species could further diverge from there. And then there's competition. So that's when two organisms are fighting again for the same limited resource. And predation, that's when one organism captures and eats another. So a predator has adaptations that allows it to be fast, agile, have camouflage, claws, teeth, stingers, things like that that allow it to actually attack its prey. And then prey have adaptations that allow them to retreat to safe locations. They also have camouflage that help them hide. There's warning coloration. So some organisms, like the coral snake, will mimic other snakes, so that way they look as if they are the poisonous one. And then also spines and thorns on plants. All right, symbiotic relationships. So remember, that's close interaction between species in which one of the species lives in or on the other species. Okay, so there's three types. This is honors only, so Gen Bio students, you can tune out for a moment. Honors only. So three types of symbiosis are mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So mutualism, both organisms benefit. Commensalism, one organism benefits or is being helped, and the other organism is unharmed or not affected at all. And then there's parasitism. So one organism is benefiting, and the other organism is harmed in some way. All right, so let's talk about population. So some populations can change drastically over time, others are more stable, and there's lots of different factors that can affect the size of a population. So there's population density. So this is how we determine the number of living organisms within a defined space. Okay, so it's a measurement of the number of individuals living in a defined space. So we can calculate this by number of individuals divided by an area or some area of units. So the population size is always changing based on four factors that are going to affect that. There's immigration, which is organisms moving into a population. Birth, so the number of organisms born. Emigration, which is organisms moving out of an area. And then there's death, so organisms passing. All right, so population growth is based on available resources. So there's two growth patterns that populations can show. So there's exponential growth and then there's logistic growth. So remember, exponential growth, there's a rapid population increase due to an abundance of resources. So populations are able to grow exponentially when there is an unlimited amount of resources available. However, most populations will show logistic growth. So this is when a population is facing limited resources. Okay, so what happens is you have this short period of exponential growth, but then it starts to level out as it starts to approach that carrying capacity. Okay, so there's limiting factors that limit how population grows. So it's something that keeps the size of a population down. So there's two types. There's density dependent and density independent. So density dependent limiting factors are those that are affected by the number of individuals in a given area. Okay, so the number of organisms within that area will determine how this kind of factor affects it. So predation, competition, parasitism, and disease are all examples of that. And then there's density independent limiting factors. So these limit population's growth regardless of the density. So regardless of the size of the population, density independent factors are going to have an impact. So this is unusual weather, natural disaster, and also human activities. So when a limiting factors change a population's growth, the population has reached its carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals in a population that the environment can support. So it's the maximum number of organisms that that environment can hold. So whether that's providing shelter, whether that's providing food, or any other type of resource, it's the maximum number of organisms that that environment can hold. All right, so human population growth. So our human population continues to grow on Earth, and the humans' carrying capacity is actually unknown. So currently we are in this state of exponential growth, but at some point we will eventually reach that carrying capacity. So while we are currently experiencing that period of exponential growth, we will eventually start to show a logistic growth curve. Okay, so these are things that have aided to help the human population grow. So technologies help to increase Earth's carrying capacity. So like the use of gas-powered farm equipment, medical advances, all those kinds of things have helped the human population to grow and for populations to actually live longer as well. Now, humans are putting a lot of pressure on natural resources. So as the humans' population grows, natural resources are receiving more pressure. So there's non-renewable resources, which are basically being used faster than they can form, so coal and oil. And then renewable resources cannot be used ever, can replenish themselves over time. So this is like wind, water, and sunlight. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about our ecological footprint. So this is the amount of land needed to support a person. So the land must produce and maintain enough food and water, shelter, energy, and waste. Okay, and then there's several things that will affect the size of an ecological footprint. So the amount and efficiency of resource use and the amount and toxicity of waste that's produced. All right, so let's talk about ecological succession. So this occurs following a disturbance in an ecosystem. So it regenerates or creates a community after a disturbance. Okay, so there's two types of succession. There's primary succession, when a community rises in a basically lifeless area. So it's started by a new species. And then secondary succession is when a disturbance of some sort has damaged an existing community. Okay, so then it'll be started by remaining species that live already in that environment. So primary succession, like a volcanic eruption, the lava will wipe away all living organisms. So that would then cause primary succession to begin starting over. And then secondary succession would be like if a forest fire occurred and the fire is not going to wipe out all living organisms. And so that environment will be able to replenish itself based on the organisms that are already living there. All right, so again, this is an honors only target, so Gen Bio, you can kind of space out for a few moments. So we're going to talk about climate. So climate's a key abiotic factor that affects the biosphere. So it's a non-living factor that has an impact on the biosphere. Okay. So climate's a long-term pattern of weather conditions. So it's your average temperature, your average precipitation, and your relative humidity. It is not your day-to-day. This is long-term patterns. Okay. So there's key factors that shape an area's climate is the temperature, sunlight, water, and wind. All right, then a microclimate is the climate of a small specific place within a larger area. Okay, so the example here is kangaroo rats. They live underground in dark forest burrows to avoid daytime desert surface conditions. Okay, so the burrow that they live in is actually considered a microclimate. All right, and there's three main zones, climate zones, are the polar, tropical, and temperate climates. So polar climate is the far northern and southern regions of Earth. Tropical zone surrounds the equator, and then the temperate zones in the wide area between the polar and tropical zones. All right, so there's an uneven heating of the biosphere, which creates these zones. So it's the angle of the sun's rays that helps determine an area's climate. So Earth's tilt-on axis will play a role in seasonal changes. Solar heating causes movements in both air and water. And then Earth's rotation also has effects on the winds and currents. So then the uneven heating of Earth's surface drives patterns for wind and precipitation, so rain, snow, and sleet. And then warm air absorbs more moisture and rises. This is why places near the equator with more direct sunlight are moist and hot. All right, then there's biomes. So a biome is land-based global communities of organisms, or a major community of organisms. So they're classified by two factors, their temperature and their amount of precipitation. All right, now we're going to talk about pollution. So this is how humans are impacting the biosphere. So pollution is any undesirable factor added to the air, water, or soil. So the types of air pollution are smog and acid rain. All right, so the greenhouse effect. So this is how the greenhouse effect occurs. So remember, we have those greenhouse gases, which essentially cause heat to be released at a slower rate, which then ultimately leads to the increase in temperature of Earth's surface. So sunlight will penetrate Earth's atmosphere, then the energy is absorbed and re-radiated as heat. Greenhouse gases will absorb longer wavelengths, and those greenhouse gas molecules re-release infrared radiation. All right. So ultimately, this all leads to global warming, which is a trend of increasing global temperatures. So it's the increased temperature of the entire globe, not just specific regions or areas. All right. So remember when we talked about biodiversity? So that's the variety of living organisms in an environment. So when biodiversity is lost, it can actually have long-term effects. Have loss of medical and technological advances, extinction of species, and loss of ecosystem stability. All right, so introduced species is a species that is brought to an ecosystem by humans, so it can disrupt stable relationships in an ecosystem. It can also create more competition within that ecosystem. Sometimes it's done on accident, and sometimes it's on purpose. And then an invasive species is one that can have some sort of environmental or economic impact and often will push out the native species in that environment. All right, then sustainable development. So this is how we can manage resources in a way, in a responsible manner that will allow resources to be available for us as we currently need them, and then also available for future generations. So fisheries is an example that we used and talked about in class. So this is rotating catches, fishing gear review, harvest reductions, and having fishing bans when necessary. All right, so here's some conservation efforts. So typically they focus on a few species, but will benefit the entire ecosystem. And then the habitat in which the species lives must be protected. And then the other species are protected because they share that ecosystem. So by protecting one species, it actually has an impact on all the organisms within that individual ecosystem. All right, then you have biodiversity hotspots. So these are small geographic areas with high concentrations of species. So these are areas where there are a large number and variety of different organisms. Okay. All right, so that's all we have for the review. Remember, your test is Monday and Tuesday of next week. If you have questions prior to that, please see your biology teacher. Thanks for watching.